Yeah. Good afternoon, Dr. Nedoh, and we're ready to start now. And
Okay.
yeah, so good afternoon to you. Good evening to everyone else present here, and whatever other time zone you're in. On behalf of the Philosophical Society of St. Stephen's College, I'm delighted to have you all here today for this lecture on titled Surplus Value as Objective Fiction, Marx and Lacan, delivered by Dr. Boštjan Nedoh. Dr. Boštjan Nedoh holds a PhD in comparative study of ideas and cultures from postgraduate school ZRC SAZU Ljubljana. He is a research fellow at the Research Center of Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts, Institute of Philosophy, Ljubljana, Slovenia. He works at the intersection between contemporary continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, biopolitics, political theology, and critical economy and social theories, and has published extensively on Lacanian psychoanalysis, Italian biopolitical theory, and contemporary French philosophy. He is the author of the book Ontology and Perversion, Deleuze, Agamben, and Lacan, published by Rodman and Litfield in 2019. And he is also co-editor of Lacan and Deleuze, a disjunctive synthesis, and also the co-editor of Objective Fictions, both published by Edinburgh Institute of Philosophy, the latter book of which is the volume from which his contribution he will be presenting today, which is about Marx's concept of surplus value read in relation with Lacan's concept of anamorphosis and how that is relates to the idea of objective fictions. So the format for today is going to be Dr. Nedoh will roughly present for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a question answer session with our audience. So over to you, Dr. Nedoh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arihant, and thanks also to the Philosophical Society of St. Stephen's College for this really kind invitation, even if it was on pretty short notice. But I'm happy to be with you today. And happy to present this talk. It's really a pleasure and honor for me at the same time. So, like Arihant announced, maybe just to make you more sense, this is how the volume looks like, and my talk will be roughly about 40 to 45 minutes. And what I'm going to do is, take the contribution from the volume and rephrase it a little bit, update it, change it, make it shorter because it would be otherwise 2 hours talk. The contribution is really long. But so before I come more specifically to the question of the surplus value and of what I will try to elaborate as objective fiction in terms of the false, what Marx calls at one specific point, false appearance between the value of labor and the value created by the labor. So this unfitting mismatch between the wage of the labor, the payment of the labor, the salary, whatever you want to call it, on the one side, and of the value produced by the labor on the other side. And this is something I'll try to convince you and to argue for, that this category deserves the term to be called with the term objective fiction, precisely to the extent that it's not the consequence of some limitations in the subjective view. So it's not it's not the illusion, which relates more to the subjective side, but is inscribed in the social structure. So before I come to this more specific case of the surplus value, let me just give you a hint of the basic idea of what the objective fiction more in general is, which is also the scope of the volume as a whole, which deals with different kinds of these objective fictions. So, and surplus value and anamorphosis is for me, at least, one of the most privileged one. And I'm just warning you in advance that, like, taking the advantage of this technology, of this online format of the event, I'm not going to upload any picture, but since you are all connected basically to your computers, you can just Google Holbein's, Hans Holbein's famous painting titled "Ambassadors," the Ambassadors from 1533, and so you'll be able to look closer to the painting when I'm going to discuss. And if you put into Google as well, Lacan schema of 4 discourses will also drop you on a hit presenting the visual schema of the discourses, so you'll be able to follow more easily the talk I'm going to present. So just a couple of sentences describing what the objective fictions in general are supposed to be. So we within the contemporary philosophy, but it's not just contemporary philosophy, this distinction may be traced even back to the ancient Greece philosophy. The distinction between nominalism and, so very roughly put, nominalism and metaphysical realism, whereby the nominalist stances in philosophy are their distinctive character is precisely the kind of absolutization of intersubjectivity, so that everything we think is codependent. Every object of thought is codependent to the subjective view on the object. What Kant would call it, or readers of Kant would call it, correlationism, etc., etc. So this is on the one hand that nominalism, in a nutshell, would be that nothing is outside the discourse, and the discourse as such is a total entity. We cannot think outside the discourse, the symbolic elaboration of what we think. On the other hand, and seemingly in contrast to nominalism, we found metaphysical realism, which, as we all know, is characterized by the idea that there are indeed objects outside our view, our subjective position towards them. So the insistence of metaphysical realism is precisely on the so-called object in itself, that the reality independent of our subjective views can and even does exist. And now the problem is that, despite, of course, nominalism and historical metaphysical realism are seemingly opposed to one another, they nevertheless overlap almost entirely on one most important premise, and this is that we can indeed distinguish very clearly between subjectivity and objectivity, between fiction and truth, so that on the one side there is a clear cut between two sides. On the one side, subjectivity, lies, appearances, fictions, etc. On the other side, truth, object in itself, reality independent of our subjective gazes. whereby what in the volume we try to elaborate under the general concept of objective fictions are precisely those concepts that do not accept or prove that this clear-cut distinction between realism, between the object in itself and subjective view on the object is impossible, and indeed is completely misleading. So the objective fictions in general would be those fictions that function in the reality in the very objective way, like the subject in both Marx and Lacan are representations of the social antagonism, which is objectively inscribed in the social structure, and it's and despite is the subject as an antagonism, its status is very, very objective, so cannot be reduced to just a discursive mediation, roughly put. So just to give you a hint, a sense of what in general objective fictions are, and let me now pass more concretely to the paper in which I'm going to discuss. First, this elaboration, the homology in Marx and Lacan between surplus enjoyment and surplus value, and then to show how the false appearance I was mentioning before has and must even have, in order to function to function as an ideological cement, to has the status of objective fiction. So objective fiction, precisely in the sense that you cannot remove just fiction and see the reality as it is, but if you remove fiction, reality itself may collapse in itself. So let me go to the first section of the paper, which is titled "The Value of Labor and Surplus Value." In a well-known and extensively discussed passage of Seminar 17, titled "The Other Side of Psychoanalysis," Lacan, Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst, says, and I quote, "Something changed in the master's discourse. At a certain point in history, we are not going to break our backs finding out if it was because of Luther, because of Calvin, or some unknown traffic of ships around Genova in Italy, or in the Mediterranean Sea, or anywhere else. For the important point is that on a certain day, surplus jouissance, enjoyment, became calculable, could be counted, could be totalized. This is where what is called the accumulation of capital begins." End of quote. Now, much, as probably some of you may know, much has been written about this homology between Marx's surplus value and Lacan's surplus enjoyment, surplus jouissance, which constitutes the core of the above cited passage. However, at least one point of this homology has remained substantially less illuminated and conceptualized than others. It is worth asking how on a certain day surplus jouissance begin to count, or surplus value. What is the logic of this counting, and especially under what conditions does surplus jouissance begin to count and adds up as surplus value? Lacan's and Marx's answers to the above question are basically the same. They are only articulated differently. But the answer is also in both cases twofold. Let us begin with Lacan. As he himself mentions at the beginning of the cited passage, the condition of the counting of the surplus value is the change in the master's discourse. And he takes as the origin of the master's discourse, just to have in mind, both at the logical level, Hegelian master-slave dialectics, but historically Aristotle's master-slave dialectics from the ancient Greece. So the change in the master's discourse, which, as Alenka Zupancic, my colleague from the Institute, has repeatedly noted, refers precisely to the separation of knowledge from labor. Recall, the starting point of Lacan's theory of the discourses is the master-slave dialectics, which is at the core of the discourse of the ancient master. This discourse of the ancient master is characterized by jouissance and knowledge being on the side of the slave and not of the master, since the essence of the master, as Lacan says, is that he does not know what he wants. It's the slave who knows what the master wants. The only thing that master should know is to give an order to the slave for the beginning of the production of the goods. So with both elements, enjoyment and knowledge, being immanently codependent in the form of slaves' practical knowledge, what Lacan calls savoir-faire, know-how. We in common parlance today we are translating this as we know this kind of knowledge as a knowledge of know-how. So according to Lacan, the modern age is marked by the discursive break, which is based on the spoliation, on the robbery of slaves' knowledge. The modern knowledge on which capitalism is based is scientific knowledge, or episteme, what Lacan in the schema of 4 discourses marks with S2, the battery of all other signifiers. If you are now able to follow the schema a little bit, you can notice that in comparison to the ancient savoir-faire, the fundamental characteristic of episteme as the modern knowledge is that it is separated from slaves' labor and as such transferable. The modern capitalist knowledge is transferable. That has important implications, of course. By taking place of the agency of the discourse, of the university discourse, which is a discourse of modern capitalism, knowledge must disavow labor as its truth, whereby the form of this disavowal is a constant valorization of the surplus created precisely by the so-called surplus labor. As Lacan emphasizes, what the ancient slave is spoliated of here is not his or her labor, or simply the products of his or her labor, but of his or her knowledge as savoir-faire. It is precisely in this discursive constellation, or with this discursive shift from the master discourse to the university discourse, that labor, separated from knowledge, begins to function as a real loss or entropy. Entropy is an important reference for Lacan to develop the logic of the surplus value, and I'll come back in a moment to that point. So real loss or entropy, which is precisely the fount of labor time that, according to Marx is the source of the surplus value. And let me just give you, you all probably know, but just to give you a short quotation from Lacan seminar 17 on entropy, what the entropy is about. He says, the quote goes as follows: I defy you to prove in any way that descending 500 meters with a weight of 80 kilos on your back, and once you have descended, going back up the 500 meters with it is zero, no work. Try it, have a go yourself, and you will find that you have proof of the contrary. But if you overlay signifiers, that is, if you enter the path of the energetics, it is absolutely certain that there has been no work, because 500 meters down, 500 meters up, the energetics will tell you the amount of work done was performed was zero. While you doing this, you will feel extremely tired, to put it really roughly. When the signifier is introduced as an apparatus of enjoyment, of jouissance, we should thus not be surprised to see something related to entropy appear, since entropy is defined precisely once one has started to lay this apparatus of signifiers over the physical world. End of quote. And so, yeah, the real loss is actually the source of the surplus value. Differently, labor becomes separated from labor time and takes the form of a stain within the knowledge, something that must necessarily be concealed if knowledge as episteme is to function as an agency of the discourse. Here, Marx's answer to the problem of the counting of surplus value is quite compatible with Lacan's, only that Marx formulates it in historical terms. The condition of the counting of the production of surplus value is the separation of men from their means of production at the end of the epoch of feudalism. It is this separation that further enables the capitalist, as the owner of capital, to find in the market workers as the possessors of not just not labor anymore, but of labor power, because what workers are selling is not labor, but labor power. So possessors of labor power characterized by having nothing to sell in the market, quote unquote from Marx, except their laboring power, their working arms and brains, end of quote. Both are formally, logically free. So both capitalists and workers are formally or legally free and equal persons who sign an employment contract by which the worker, as the possessor of the labor power, makes his or her labor power available to the owner of capital for a determined, that is not unlimited, but determined, limited time, and against the payment, which is expressed in the wage, in labor's wage. The spontaneous and therefore ideological understanding of this situation is the following. Labor creates value by which the owner of capital covers all the costs. In addition to workers' wage, also all other production costs such as machines, raw materials, rent for land, etc., etc. And must then sell the products or services at higher price, with the difference between selling price and the costs being precisely the surplus value, which gives rise to profit. According to this wrong explanation, surplus value would emerge in the process of exchange or circulation. So not in the production, but later when it's added to what is produced. However, such is actually not the case, as everybody who have read even superficially Marx knows that this is not the case. And cannot recommend you more to read the Marx short essay entitled "Wages, Price, and Profit," which is written and published almost simultaneously as with the first volume of Capital. So in this essay, Marx is categorical about it, and I quote, "To explain, therefore, the general nature of profits, you must start from the theorem that, on an average, commodities are sold at their real values, and that profits are derived from selling them at their values, that is, the real values, that is in proportion to the quantity of labor realized in them." So Marx's point is, of course, that surplus value is not added to the existing value contained in the commodities, but is inscribed already in their production from the very beginning. Now it's the question, how? What does it mean that profit is already derived from selling products at their real values without all the surcharges that the owner of capital can or cannot afford in view of the monopolistic or competitive market position of his or her products? In answering this question, we have to step onto the terrain of the famous labor theory of value. In the market, the products of labor are sold or exchanged for the universal equivalent, which is money, because this is the logic of the labor theory of value. Because the same amount of abstract or simple human labor measured by the abstract or simple labor time is realized in these products. So the ratio that allows the exchange of products via the mediation of money is the same amount of quantity for Marx, the same amount of quantity of the abstract labor measured in labor time in these products. So in addition to money, labor is one of the forms of the real abstraction produced by capitalism. That's crucial. Real abstraction. With the use of human labor, the value of raw materials and other means of production whose value is constant, this is what Marx calls constant capital, is just transferred to the products. While as a special commodity, among other commodities, there is a special commodity, which is labor power, which has specific characteristic that besides its own value, which is expressed in the wages or the value of its own reproduction, it also adds to new products a surcharge or additional value, which is why Marx names this part of the capital reserved for the purchase of the labor power variable capital, because it varies. The constant capital only is in the same amount just transferred to the new products from raw materials, land, etc., etc. Labor power as a variable capital adds some new value to the existing transference of value from raw materials. Precisely since this value multiplies in the process of the production. By being used, labor power reproduces all the past value of raw materials used thereby and the means of production and the value of itself as labor power, while adding a surcharges to all this. The surcharge is created due to what Marx calls surplus labor. Surplus labor is precisely the difference between the labor time spent on the reproduction of value, including the reproduction of the value of labor power expressed in wages, and the entire labor time for which the worker has hired out his or her labor power. The value or the price of the labor power is always smaller than the value of the performed labor. So I think hope it's quite clear that on the one side, you are paid for working, for example, 8 hours. But in these 8 hours, you produce the value that much exceeds the cost of your own payment, of your own wage. Without this surplus labor time, there will be no profit in capitalism, couldn't simply work. So it is precisely this surplus labor power that is the source of surplus value, which in Marx is further divided into interest, rent, and of course profit. This is why the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit depend especially on the proportion between the value or price of labor power and the value that labor power creates in the production process. The higher the value of labor power wage expressed in wages, the lower the final rate of profit and vice versa. But the value of labor power will never be equal to the created value. In that case, the rate of profit would be, of course, zero. There will be no profit. It is precisely this difference between the two values that Marx calls exploitation, which is completely formal, objective, and independent of the subjective feelings of exploitation. It exists where there is surplus labor, which exists wherever there are capitalist relations of production, regardless of the workers subjectively feeling exploited or not feeling exploited. With these basic elements of the buying and selling of labor power, the abstraction of labor and surplus labor, which constitute the system of wage labor, we obtain not only two, but all three necessary elements of the capitalist accumulation of capital. First, the reproduction of value of raw materials and labor power. Second, the production of surplus value deriving from surplus labor time. And most importantly, the third one, what Marx calls the semblance of labor, which is precisely the ideological supplement necessary for the ideological reproduction of capitalist relation of production. I will now examine this supplement in more detail and hopefully show that it has the structure of the anamorphic structure, so which is why it deserves to be called objective fiction. As I mentioned that the source of surplus value is surplus labor, which Marx correctly notes is unpaid labor. But to this, Marx immediately adds that the peculiarity of the wage system, and let us add, of the ideological success of capitalism, which is based on wage labor is precisely that, quote unquote, unpaid labor seems to be paid labor. And a shorter quote from Lacan, from Marx' Wages, Price and Profit essay. Although one part only of the workman's daily labor is paid, while the other part is unpaid, and while that unpaid or surplus labor constitutes exactly the fund out of which surplus value or profit is formed, it seems as if the aggregate labor, so the total labor, was paid labor. This false appearance distinguishes wages labor from other historical forms of labor, end of quote. Marx believes that the first reason for this false appearance, according to which the value or price of laboring power takes the semblance of the price or value of labor itself, should be sought in the known time lag between the production process of creating value and the payment of the workers' wages, which are paid out only after the weekly or monthly cycle of the reproduction process of the capital has been completed. This is not only not the only reason. Since the peculiarity of the wages system on which capitalism and the production of the surplus value are based lies precisely in merging the paid and unpaid portions of labor time, thereby producing the appearance that all performed labor power is paid labor, meaning that during the entire labor time, workers produce the value that they are later paid for by their wages. The objective existence of the unpaid labor is manifested only on the unconscious other scene, eine andere Schauplatz, as Freud would say, in the persistence of the surplus value within the capitalist knowledge as a stain. Without unpaid labor, there would be no surplus value and consequently no profit. The key point here is that the semblance of labor does not emerge outside the framework of capitalist production or in the ideological superstructure, which includes human rights, the observance of contractual and legal relations, which the purchase and the sale of the labor power are based on, but is produced by the relations of production themselves or by the wages system. Precisely because this false appearance originates not in the ideological apparatuses outside production, but in the mode of production itself, it corresponds to the term objective fiction. Fiction or appearance that is not simply a consequence of a false subjective view, but is produced by objective reality or the discourse of capitalism itself. In other words, ideology is already inscribed in the social base, in the relations of production. Now, at this point, we come across the question of the precise structure of this false appearance, a related question which I'm maybe going to address more in the Q&A if anyone's going to be interested in this. So the question of how Marx even manages to see the difference between paid and unpaid or surplus labor within the structure of appearance that precisely erases this difference. So there seems to be no difference between paid and unpaid labor. And the question is how Marx nevertheless saw this difference. So in short, how does Marx trace within the entire labor time in which there is no manifest difference between the working hours during which the value of labor is labor power is reproduced and the hours that constitutes the surplus labor time, difference between the two separate segments, the second of which, that is surplus labor, is the source of the surplus value. And now, if I already anticipated this, it might reference to Lacan's Anamorphosis might be very helpful here. So I'm going now to the second and the last section, which is titled "The Structure of Surplus Value," which has the structure of Anamorphosis. Lacan provides his first, more extensive analysis of the phenomenon of anamorphosis in Holbein's *The Ambassadors*. If you're able to open it up on the internet, I think it's easier to follow. So he provides first more extensive analysis of the phenomenon of anamorphosis in Holbein's *The Ambassadors* painting in his seminar 7, *The Ethics of Psychoanalysis*, where he points out, among other things, that anamorphosis is a distinctly modern phenomenon. It appears especially in 16th and 17th century European painting, which, in a structural sense, follows the changes in the field of modern science, especially geometry, and the discovery of the so-called geometrical laws of perspective. According to its basic definition, anamorphosis is a spatial illusion, or, quote, any kind of construction that is made in such a way that by means of an optical transposition, a certain form that was not visible at first sight transforms itself into a readable image. The pleasure is found in seeing its emergence from an undecipherable form. End of quote. The anamorphic painting technique thus introduces an additional twist to the classical painting technique by including a stain in the painting or constructing a painting within a painting. It produces a materialization of the void, or an extimate surface, which is extimate precisely because two spaces come together on the same surface and thereby become twisted and curved, so that the outside and inside appear on the same curved space and are no longer separated from each other. And let me just unpack, sorry, just wanted to check, do I have some, I don't know, 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, you have the time, and I've also yeah, you have like 10 to 15 minutes.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, that's more than enough. Thank you. So just briefly unpack. If you recall the, I don't know, famous contest between painters, ancient painters, Zeuxis versus Parrhasius, the point of painting, as for example Darian Leader emphasized in his book on the stealing of Mona Lisa, especially in ancient times, the task of painting was to who would deceive more. So the create picture so real that would deceive the gaze of the subject, that the subject's gaze can be just in some sense stolen from the subject. That's the point of the painting. The painting, the split between the subject and the gaze, so that our gaze does not overlap with our eyes, so to speak. Our gaze becomes on the side of the painting and does not belong to us anymore. And the anamorphosis, yeah, thanks for sharing the picture. So anamorphosis is a picture within the picture, so that, as I'll try to elaborate now, it surprises you when you see that what at first glance appear as a stain at the bottom of the painting, all of a sudden you realize is a human skull. But the price you have to pay is that when you decipher the stain as the human skull, you lose the rest of painting. So, as has been said many times, the main point of anamorphosis developed by Lacan in his seminar 11, based on the paradoxical stain in Holbein's Ambassadors, is that the gaze is the object. That is, it does not belong to the subject that stands opposite external objects, but as such belongs to the painting itself or the geometrical field of the visible. The gaze is not a medium of cognition, but is something that the subject encounters in the painting, in the transformation of the whole painting to an unclear stain, as a painting within a painting, which, with the change of perspective, turns out to be a human skull. The price to be paid is, of course, losing the rest of the painting the moment the stain turns out to be an image meaning. Lacan's emphasis here, however, is not so much on the fact that with the change in perspective, the stain changes into a meaningful image, but on the gaze as the object A, being an external objective materialization or the representative of the subject as a split, as a lack of being. So the gaze is represented, is split from the subject, separated from the subject, but it's at the same time the marker of the subject in the painting. In the field of the visible, the subject as a lack of being, which is a basic definition of the subject by Lacan, is inscribed in the painting together with his or her desire, precisely to the presentation of the gaze as the objectia, object small a. It is this structure that enables the satisfaction of desire, deciphering, the satisfaction in deciphering the stain, and the production of what Lacan calls surplus enjoyment from the successful deciphering of the stain. The stain in Holbein's painting can function as a screen or a stand-in for the gaze, to borrow Mladen Dolar's expression, precisely because it corresponds to the basic characteristic of the object small a in Lacan's theory. That is, it is actually an anti-image, since it does not have its specular image or otherness. To cut a long story short, for those who are not so much familiar with Lacanian theory, there are objects which have their mirror images, so things existing in reality. But then there are, for Lacan, what he calls the object small a, which are for example, the gaze, the voice, which are those objects that nevertheless carries the status of the object, but are not material in a physical sense, but material in the sense of the effects they produce in the discourse, the object also of desire. We need to desire to see something in order to be able to observe. Lacan's point here is that it does not lie simply in the satisfaction gained from a successful deciphering of the unclear image or stain, but rather that in so doing, one already transforms the stain into a positive image, whereby losing its very function as one existing merely as a disturbing or detotalizing moment in the painting, and not as separated from it in any way. For the stain is not an other image, an autonomous entity, which breaks into the field of the visual from the outside, but other of the image itself, an internal short circuit of the field of visible vision itself. The success of deciphering the stain as a positive image already conceals the fact that the field of the visible is the totalized at the ontological level and not on the ontic level. That is why, as I already mentioned, Lacan's key point about the phenomenon of anamorphosis does not lie in the deciphering of the enigmatic stain itself, but in articulating the stain as a stand-in for the subject in the painting. Put it differently, the gaze as an object belongs to the geometrical field of the visible, and as such is also a marker for the place of subject inscription in the painting itself. The subject and the object are no longer separated, and in the sense of the interior and the exterior of the painting, but belong to the same field of its effects. It seems that surplus value in Marx has exactly the same structure as the anamorphic stain in Holbein's The Ambassadors. Even more, it seems that at the level of painting, The Ambassadors even directly visualizes this structural paradox. It does so not only at the level of the structural relation between the stain and the entire painting that I have discussed thus far, but also at the level of the depicted figures, whereby The Ambassadors visualizes the real of the structure in both senses of the word. The painting depicts nothing other than modern scientific knowledge itself. Ambassadors surrounded by instruments of knowledge and technical tools characteristic of modern science, which is precisely the knowledge that is established with the spoliation, robbery of the slave's practical knowledge of savoir-faire. It is with the separation of knowledge from the slave's labor. This separation simultaneously transforms the labor itself, which, with the discursive break or change in the master's discourse, as Lacan says, acquires a form of an entropic surplus value, which Lacan marks with the object small a. One of Lacan's points regarding surplus labor as entropic loss is precisely that it becomes invisible from the point of view of modern knowledge. In descending and ascending the hill along the same path, the signifiers of energetics say that no work was performed. In the same way, when looking at the painting as a whole, the human skull appears as a stain. And perhaps it is no coincidence that in The Ambassadors, the surplus labor, which is the source of the surplus value and surplus enjoyment, is depicted precisely by a stain that, with the change of perspective, obtains the image of the human skull, which is, of course, the classical image of death. In this respect, in The Ambassadors, the stain as the materialization of the surplus value, and surplus enjoyment is depicted precisely by a skull as a metaphor of the death drive, which is materialized in the gaze as the objectia in the painting. However, the point here lies not in deciphering the stain or the surplus, whereby we would lose the rest of the painting, but rather in the fact that, as in the case of entropy, the stain emerges only within the painting, only within the signifiers themselves, and does not exist independently thereof. We come across precisely the same point as to the production of surplus value in Marx, who claims that in the production process, surplus value is produced as its surplus and not as an autonomous independent entity. If surplus labor is the fount of the abstract labor time, from which there derives surplus value, then we shall say that this amount of labor time is not an independent amount, that at the phenomenal level, it cannot be clearly separated from the amount of time used for the reproduction of the value of labor power. In the case of producing surplus value, we should rather say that the surplus labor sticks to abstract labor precisely as its internal stain, an internal short circuit that cannot be visually separated from the entire amount of abstract labor, but rather functions as a purely formal internal discursive surplus over the signifying articulation through which the capitalist production is organized. If surplus value was only an extra discursive addition to this form of exploitation, would rather correspond to the pre-capitalist feudal form of labor and not to the wages system on which capitalism is based on. Just a couple of minutes more. I'm at the very last paragraph. And it seems that one of the main ideological features of the infinite accumulation of capital is nothing other than a constant attempt at deciphering this traumatic stain. The owners of capital constantly reinvest surplus value, whereby attempt to increase the volume and thereby they attempt to increase the volume of production and consequently accumulation, while the owners of labor power, the workers, decipher this stain precisely by recognizing in it a positive image, the wage, as the image of their own value of labor power, which is nothing other than the false appearance according to which the value of labor power appears as the value of labor itself. And to bring this contribution to a close, I can only briefly add that Marx's insistence on eliminating the wages system as such, and not simply on increasing the value of labor power within this system, implies precisely his insistence on the structural primacy of the discourse over the stain alone. While the temptation we should resist is precisely the satisfaction in deciphering it, in deciphering the stain, in deciphering the surplus value, in isolating the stain from its structural causes. The goal of the new political economical constellation that Marx calls communism is thus neither the deciphering of the stain, which merely reproduces the existing field of the visible, or the relations of production, nor a naive attempt at erasing the stain, but a different new articulation of the relation between the stain and the entire painting. And a hint, maybe a communism as a stain that becomes the painting itself. I stop here. Thank you very much, and I hope I was still within my time frame.
Yeah, it's exactly 7 o'clock over here, 7 p.m. So thank you for that lecture, Dr. Nedoh. And now we will be taking questions from our audience. So if you have a question, then you may please raise your hand. And in the meanwhile, I'll ask my question, which came from my reading of the paper. So towards the end, you suggest that communism, as Marx tries to imagine it, might not involve erasing the stain of surplus value, but in reconfiguring the whole painting. So could you just like expand on that, on what that would mean organizationally, politically, imaginatively, this idea of reconfiguration of the painting itself?
Yeah, it was like in the published paper was still, and I hope I emphasized enough. It was written with a question mark at the end, so it's more a suggestion to think about. But the point of this would be more not what can we get out of this, but to resist this false dilemma between the stain and the painting. or between the value and the labor. It is to reconfigure the entire field so that the relation between painting and the stain wouldn't be a relation of exploitation, to put it in a quite maybe abstract way. To maybe it would be to include more the subject into the painting itself. The subject, in a sense, even in the sense of the proletariat or the labor power, because the homology would imply that there is a separation between the two levels. And this separation causes the way you see the distinction between the paid and unpaid labor. So it's a big question, and honestly, I don't have any further answer than this abstract one. But it's a point I would need to think further when expanding the paper. So, but thank you. It's a tough question.
Yeah, I understand that. And on the point of homology, so like your primary reference from Lacan for this is like seminar 16, I'm sorry, like where he talks about the homology of surplus, Marx's surplus value to his own surplus enjoyment. So I was just wondering, like, why use the term homology, and what does it entail to specifically call this relation between the two a homology and not something like an analogy or whatnot?
Yeah, I think much has been already written and discussed about why precisely the homology, because the point is that the surplus value is constructed via or to put it to frame it phrase it in another way. Both surplus value and surplus enjoyment are structured, are generated according to on the basis of the entropy, what is the real loss, and therefore the relation between the two is internal. So structurally, there are homologous, belong to the same structure. It are not two structures that are separated from one another, and then we can make analogies between one and the second. So for Lacan, it's actually the homology would mean precisely that when we talk about one, we already talk about at the same time about the other. Is that at least clear?
I understand that. Yeah, and so okay, one more thing from me. So you described surplus value as a kind of stain to the internal structure of the university discourse and master's discourse. So much like, Lacan's objectivity, if I'm reading this correctly. So if the subject is produced within the structure as a barred subject, as the whole four discourses schema shows, then does it have any capacity in itself to resist or disrupt this logic of surplus value? Or is like any attempt to see or act from the position of the stained already always like captured by the system's ideological form and form of production?
Yeah, I don't, that's the problem of university discourse. It has no potential to the vector of impotency between the subject, from the subject to the S1 is precisely that the subject cannot ever reach the position of the capital, so to speak. To use Marx's example, the ideology, so legal framework as an ideological framework of capitalism would say everybody is free, everybody has the possibility with savings, asceticism, etc. In principle, everybody has the possibility to gain the position of the capital. But at the same time, structurally speaking, this is it's impossible. And so this is why Lacan's insistence is that there needs to be a hysterization of the discourse in order to produce or the passage to the discourse of the analyst, because university discourse is so sterile that as we can observe in the world today, whatever resistance, there are important, and this is why resistance is absolutely important. Resistance here, resistance there. There might be the manifestations of the hysterization of the university discourse, which only can bring. So only through this hysterization, some changes can occur. But at the same time, we can observe really the almost infinite amount of potentiality in the university discourse to sterilize, devalorize all these attempts at subverting it. Precisely by producing the subject as a surplus of falling out of the enjoyment. Of the discourse.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. So, do we have any questions from our audience? If you have, then you may raise your mic and ask, raise your hand, or just unmute your mic directly and just ask the question. So I believe we don't have any questions more than that. So yes, thank you very much for that lecture, Dr. Nedoh. And I believe that has been really valuable and interesting for all of us. And yeah, so thank you very much. And I do have one small query. So on this is just like a request. So on the theory of four discourses, could you recommend some reading other than Lacan's own seminar, which would help clarify this to us? Because that is quite a difficult thing to understand at first go.
As in the case of basically all published seminars, sooner or later there appear a volume of the reading seminar texts, and there is a very, very good volume, reading seminar 17. So reading seminar 17, which contains the original, but at the same time very interpretative texts, readings of the seminar itself. And for example, Alenka Zupancic's text in this volume, that would be highly recommended. And one can much easier get the point of the four discourses. Also, Samo Tomšić he's wrote a book The Capitalist Unconscious, Marx and Lacan, in which he also discusses this homology and the overlap and the basics of the theory for discourses. So yeah, those are primary reading, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And thank you for this lecture. It's been truly helpful for all of us. So good day ahead to you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for a very kind invitation. And I do apologize if I was maybe too technical, but I try to do my best to explain as much as possible. But more rough thing, more tough thing to understand. But I did my best. I hope you got at least something from the lecture. And yeah, again, thanks for this kind of invitation. And did I got you correctly? You have this student fest now called Prasna, or?
Yeah. The student fest was on the 15th and the 16th. It was at the same time as your 2-week continued series. Yeah. And this would be like the final event of our present academic year.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
the closing event.
That's great. Yeah. Even if it's over, good fest.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you very much.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody.